Hi everybody, this is Kevin McManigal with Map Practical. This is lecture number 3 for Advanced Cartographic Design. Today we're going to be talking about cartographic workflows for production mapping. Most of us use GIS in our everyday to-day work with spatial data, but geographic information systems don't export the highest quality cartographic products. To make a map like what you see here, the age of borders, obviously there's geographic data that goes in with the borders of all the countries, and then the attribute data might have the date that they were established. But to get the kind of look that you want, the aesthetically pleasing type design, color design, and overall layout requires a move into graphic design software. And that's where we get into Adobe Illustrator, Photoshop, and InDesign. So today we're going to look at this and just give you a brief glimpse of the workflow that I teach, and then of course in the labs we'll get into it and learn the fine details. So what's wrong with the standard GIS output? Well, nothing. It's okay. It works. This was a map I made of forest types for a quick forest survey. It worked. It's okay. It was just a real quick down and dirty map, but you can still see it's kind of raw data-ish, right? The lines aren't smooth. Type isn't exactly how I'd like it because I'm dealing with the limitations of the software. And there's some kind of a threshold there where playing around in ArcGIS software to get the labeling just right, you start to lose your efficiencies, and at some point it's just worth it to export out into something like Adobe Illustrator where you have total control, right? So this map's all right. It served its purpose. It was fine. I got paid. That's half the battle right there. But for that same consulting company I was working with, they also needed a map for another project that was a little more high-end. So this is a large format printed on a big poster topo map of a forest that they were going to go in and do forest typing in the field, right? And so they wanted a topo map of really high quality, excellent line work, clear, concise type, and land cover, right? This is not the kind of thing that you're going to get out of stock outputs in GIS. So when you start thinking about the kind of maps that you see published out there, like in National Geographic, you know that they're producing these things in the graphic design software. So to get this kind of nice fades, nice colors, good type work, the arrows in decent colors and nice curves, all that vector work is done in Adobe Illustrator. You'll never see anything published in National Geographic that comes right out of ArcGIS software. Right? It just doesn't have the quality that they're looking for, right? In order to get a layout like this, you really need to utilize the graphic design software. All of the rasters in the background here, that shaded relief, that's all worked up in Photoshop, color corrected, allows you to do blends where just you can highlight the countries that you want, like Latin America here, right? And then the shaded relief in North America is just faded into the background so it doesn't stand up as much, right? All that type work has to be set in either Illustrator or InDesign. And then all the vector line work on the map. The only way to have total and complete control and be able to get the look you want is in a vector graphics program like Illustrator, right? And then moving into even higher end oblique maps like the experts at National Geographic like Martin Gamesh are producing. This map of Everest, it requires the use of GIS data, so you're using a digital elevation model that's draped with satellite imagery and then put into 3D inside the GIS software and then rotated to the view you want. But then that raster is exported out, brought into Photoshop where you can do all your color corrections, the fades, the blends that make the map really pop, right? And then of course brought in to Illustrator and set as the background, and then all the vector line work, all of the graphic text, everything then is laid out in a vector art program. Also, the kind of maps that you see coming out of the National Park Service. These are not stock GIS maps. Beautiful maps by the likes of Tom Patterson, probably the expert shaded relief artist in the whole country, now retired from the Park Service and then has passed those skills along to the up-and-comers, right, in the cartographic department. Beautiful map of Glacier National Park that you can get for free when you go into the parks. And then taking it to the other level, so zooming in, looking at the go into the sun road with really nice shaded relief done in Photoshop, multiple layers and blends, sun hints, a little bit of depth perspective on the water bodies, and then again, excellent type work all done in Adobe Illustrator, right? Even the maps that are just a simple locator map, you can see that it's been done in a graphic software program. Just to get that fade would be almost impossible to do in ArcGIS. Now you might be able to work a GIS software to get there, but how much time is it going to take? How much struggling and wrestling the alligator are you willing to do before it's just easier to get a nice clean image, export it on out, and then take care of it inside of the graphic design software? Right? And this doesn't mean that even beautiful hand-painted works of art are completely devoid of geographic accuracy. So maps like this, like Michael Reagan, who paints beautiful maps for the Smithsonian and some in National Geographic and many other publications, he's using GIS vectors for the accuracy of the borders and the line work, and then that gets exported out and maybe brought into Photoshop where he paints his watercolors with pen tools and so forth, or even printed as a blank page with black lines where he paints then in real colors, right, real watercolors, and then scans it, brings it back into something like Illustrator to do the type work. Beautiful stuff, really beautiful work. Add illustrations, all this stuff. But it's geographically accurate, right? Projected, accurate data. Here you can see the rivers and so forth, and they're all accurate. So, how do we do this? How do we get past the standard GIS export? Well, this whole lecture is about one way that we go about it. There are multiple ways to do this. I have chosen one specific workflow and slowly evolved it over time. And as software changes, I might have to completely adopt a new workflow because the options that I used to utilize could disappear. And I'll mention that a little bit. So, but what we're trying to do is move the data out of GIS into the graphic design software. So at the GIS level, we want to use that software for doing all the things it does best, right? It's going to help us manage attributes, do analysis, combine data sets, dissolve data sets, some simplification. But at some point, it's a negative return. We're not getting value for our time spent, and then we got to get it out. So the options are, of course, probably the king of the hill is ArcGIS Desktop. That's the one I still use, but a contender that's coming down the road is ArcGIS Pro. Many people are moving into Pro, but for professional cartographers, in their first releases anyways, there was some serious issues with exporting out to Adobe Illustrator. Then there's the freeware like QGIS and other GIS software like FME. I've never even used FME, but I thought I'd include it as a possible option. All right, so you want to get your vectors out. You do all the work that you can inside of GIS, and then you make sure that you have all of your work set up in a very specific pattern. I actually go through that in a document called GIS to Illustrator Export, and it'll be linked below in the description. But the key is that you follow this thing explicitly. Every single little step matters. You can't have any transparencies. You don't want to have certain things filled. Certain objects should just be outlined, so on and so forth, so that when it comes out of ArcGIS Desktop into Adobe Illustrator.ai, it's nice and clean. All right. The very first versions of Arc Pro, they didn't have the AI export anymore at all. So you had to put things in just SVG, which is standard vector graphics. There were some issues with that, like it didn't retain all of the layer names and so forth. In newest versions now of ArcGIS Pro, they've started with this .AIX, and I'll go into what that actually gives you. It requires a plugin in Illustrator, but it is free. QGIS, all you get is SVG, right? So in Adobe Illustrator, you get a native AI export out of desktop, and it goes right in, retains all the layers, especially if you follow my steps in how to set up the data before you export it. In Pro now, you can get an ArcGIS Maps for the Creative Cloud plugin that goes right into Illustrator, and it will bring in the data exported from Arc Pro. Still a little buggy, still trying to work it out and get it perfect, but it probably is the future. That's probably where we're headed, especially if they depreciate Arc Desktop and it no longer exists anymore. QGIS, it's going to give you those SVGs, but there's no layers involved. So you just get a data dump of vectors and you have to go in there and clean it all up, right? And FME, I'm pretty sure it does an SVG export, and it definitely will read into Illustrator, but again, you have those layer problems. Raster output, so our vectors and our rasters are totally separate. Our vectors are points, lines, polygons, and type all come out as vectors. Okay, but our shaded relief or our land cover or any raster that we have is a totally different export out of the GIS software. And ubiquitously across, TIFF is probably the way to go, a tagged image format. It's a lossless version. There's no compression. You could use a JPEG, but you start to lose some of your resolution. So I would just go with TIFF. They probably also have PNGs and other raster formats that you can export out, but I just stay at the high end. I figure as I'm moving through different software, I just want to have as much resolution as I can to start with. I can always reduce it, but it's hard to add extra after you've gotten it out of the GIS software. So you would do all of your different layers for shaded relief, like maybe your hill shade, your hypsometric tint, your texture layer. Export those out as full resolution TIFFs, and then those would be brought into Adobe Photoshop. All right. So Photoshop is going to be where you'll stack all of your layers. All right. You'll bring in that TIFF natively, and you'll bring in each one individually and use all the blending modes and the transparencies and all the great tools that Photoshop gives you for making really nice raster shaded relief. The kind of stuff that you can simulate okay back up in ArcGIS, but nothing like you can do in Photoshop. All right, there's a couple things in parentheses here. Map Publisher is a plugin for Adobe Illustrator, and Geographic Imager is a plugin for Photoshop. And both of those are an extra piece of software that you have to buy, and they allow you to read geographic data right into the design software. So Map Publisher lets you read shape files right into Illustrator. The problem is you don't have very much analytic power. So if you want to do some serious analysis with your data, you still have to have GIS. All right? If you're just going for just simple line work and you just need to grab a layer of streets, bring it into Illustrator, maybe that's a way to go. And I know a lot of people do use the Map Publisher plugin, but I don't teach it because it's just one more thing that students would have to purchase or have on their computer. And if you have to have GIS anyways to do your analysis, then there's a way to get through the entire workflow without the plugins. The Geographic Imager, that just reads geotagged images, so GeoTIFFs. So things will line up. So you could put your land cover or your DEM right over, and it'll line right up with the Map Publisher vectors that you bring into Illustrator. All right. Now there are some alternatives to all these things, right? So if you don't want to pay for Adobe Illustrator, you can go out and you could use Inkscape, right? Or you could use SVG Edit. They're getting better. They're open source. They're free, but they don't have all the tools. Really, the industry standard, of course, is the Adobe Creative Cloud Suite. Since we're teaching people to go out and be professionals, it's most likely they're going to run into things like Adobe Illustrator out there. But if you're working for an NGO that doesn't have any money, or just trying to get your art business off the ground, your cartographic business on your own, you might have to go with some of these free open source alternatives. Right? The raster alternatives are GIMP and Krita. GIMP is pretty popular, really powerful actually. You could probably get away with doing some nice blends of shaded relief inside of GIMP, but nobody would know the difference. So if you can only buy one, I'd say buy Illustrator and then go with some of the other ones. Now, I only teach one of these particular workflows, right? And it's this one here. So our GIS option is ArcGIS Desktop. We take all of our vectors out in an AI format. We bring them into Illustrator without the Map Publisher plugin at all. It just goes right in native. We can see all of our layers. We clean up some of the clipping masks, organize things a little bit. All of our rasters get exported to TIFFs, right? 300 DPI, nice high resolution. We take them into Photoshop and we clean them up. We use the blending modes. We get everything to look really sweet. And then we take that saved TIFF and just add it as one of the base layers inside of Illustrator. So it becomes placed into the Illustrator document, and then we could do all of our vector line work and our text over the top of it in vector space. Okay. So here's a workflow that I devised some years back when I was working for Adventure Cycling Association. Adventure Cycling Association is really cool. They're the largest bicycle travel organization in the entire country. They have a route network that covers the entire United States and a little bit up into Canada, and it's got over 48,000 miles of mapped routes. Every one of those routes has map panels that fold down into about a day's ride and fit right on a handlebar carrier, and it shows every single turn, so turn-by-turn directions in either direction on the route, and then also the services that a bicyclist might need along the way. It's an incredible organization. Now, I came into the organization when they were just converting from a strictly graphic design model for making their maps to a geographic to graphic design workflow. I believe now they've changed their stuff up a bit, and I believe they're using Map Publisher, but that's just because the natural progression of different cartographers coming through their shop and the way that they moved into the future. I don't slight them in any way for that. I think that's great, but this is how I did it when I was there. So towards the end of my tenure, they were producing a new route called the Sierra Cascades Bicycle Route. Right? It was going to be 2,300 some odd miles long. They researched it in the summer of 2008, and it was scheduled to be released in 2010, right when I was in grad school and working as a full-time cartographer. And it created these loop routes, which was really interesting because they already had established routes. They had a coastal route along the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington. They had a southern tier route that went across the southern part of the United States, a northern tier, Lewis and Clark route. So all these different routes intersected and created all these cool loops. All right. So how did we do this? Well, we had to go out and get the data. So we sent this guy out, right? And he went and rode every single mile of the route. In the old days, there was some of that, but actually that's a little bit difficult. So in the newer form, we sent someone out with a highly specialized route collection software system, right? So they had maps, they had a computer, they had a GPS, and they had this piece of software called Optacker. Optacker was created by Rich Ketchum. It's a really, really cool guy and a really cool piece of software that allows you to drive a route. It takes the track, and every time you come to a corner, you just hit a hotkey on the computer, and you can type right in, turning from First Street onto A Street left, right? It goes right into the database. You pass a bicycle store, you just type in the name and the address, and you go in and maybe get a business card, and then you can add that information as well. All that information was collected by this gentleman driving the entire route, right? And then that data was sent to me as the GIS professional, right? So I downloaded all that data out of Optacker and brought it into ArcGIS. And all these points going down the entire route are all the route markers that they took as they drove the entire route. And each one of them has attribute data, okay? Now, that needs to be laid out into map panels that are easily styled and consumable and able to fold and go right into that map carrier that fits right on the handlebars of a cyclist. So, what we did is we laid it all out in map panels, and these might be a little bit difficult to see, but these little squares, this red line running here, that's the route. So I went in and used those route markers to find all the streets and select them out of the streets database that Esri used to provide with their software, right? And then I had to break it up into those one-day travel map panels. In the old days at Adventure Cycling, when I first came in, they would take a USGS topo map and they would highlight the route over it, and then they had a cardboard cutout that was the right size of their map panels. And they would place that onto the route on the USGS topo map and then trace it out with a pencil. And then move it over, having slight overlap with the last square, right? So there'd be a match line right there, and trace it again and do that all the way down the route, as you've seen I've done in the digital way here, all the way down the route, right? Then they would scan that traced square of the topo map, and then they would bring that into a pop-up on screen and then hand digitize the route, the contour lines, and create a map that was specifically designed to look like Adventure Cycling's maps. A lot of work. They were doing that all in freehand. Freehand was an old vector software program made by Macromedia, back in about 2004, 2005. Adobe bought Macromedia. They wanted it for Flash, but then they killed freehand. And so everybody was being forced to make the move into Illustrator. So Adventure Cycling still had all of their routes and maps done in freehand. and they needed to move to Illustrator, and it was a perfect time to also find a new way to do, instead of just a hand trace, to do the geographic data using GIS. So that's what they brought me on board, was to invent a system so that we could get past the days of just tracing things out with a cardboard cutout template and get it into more of a digital template inside of GIS. So that's what I did for this route. I created all those map panels, right? Then I needed to process GIS data. So there's still a lot of heavy GIS here. What I ended up doing was creating this really big model inside of GIS using the Model Builder tool. There's really no way to do this by clicking on every single tool, because it would just take too long. So what we have is all the different data that we need to get clipped down to the size of one of those map panels. So in the model, that first circle, that's one map panel of the route. And then it goes through and it runs the model and does all of the GIS styling of that data, and then spits it out into a geodatabase that is specifically for that map panel. In between there, it might run through and say clip out individual streets and select them based on their code, which could be for interstate, right? Or it takes a digital elevation model that covers the entire route, clips out that map panel, runs it through a number of iterations to make a nice hill shade, right? And then maybe even converts it and creates contours out of it in feet if it was in meters. And then all that data eventually is dumped into one geodatabase. This took a long time. I didn't just build this out this size and then hit go, because it'll just fail. So when you're working in something like this, you build a small part of the model and then you run it. Okay, that one works, super. Then you build the next piece, you tie the two together and run it and see if it goes. Oh, it failed. Well, I know it was the new piece I just added. So you debug that and figure it out. And that's how it goes. So just building this out took a couple months. But once it was done, and I have all of the map sheets in a folder, right? So all the map panels, I can just tell this to iterate through that entire folder and go, and just let it run, and the model will run over and over again until it rips through all of those map panels in one folder and spits out all the data for every map sheet. So when it's finally set up, it can save you an enormous amount of time. All right, let's take a look at a couple pieces of it. This was the top one that was the clip. So it just grabbed the map panel, went down and clipped the entire streets database, then it selected out, and it's selected based on these FCC codes. And those codes, you just have to look in the attribute data, right? And then look in the metadata and see what they stand for. But in the end, what they did is they selected out an interstate for me. And then that interstate was simplified a little bit to get rid of some of those jagged edges. We take care of more of those in Illustrator. And then it spits it all out and puts it into the main geodatabase. And that process is run over and over again on all the different features. So we've got different line features like our streams, our rivers, our roads, right? The contour lines would be clipped like that. And then things would need to get labeled as well. The shaded relief model also did something similar to this. So it would clip it out based on that map panel, and then it would go ahead and run one part. So the top part of the shaded relief model would take care of converting it from meters to feet and producing contour lines for us that are in feet. So as an American audience, that's what we want, right? The bottom one would cut out the DEM, leave it in meters because we're just doing a shaded relief with it, and then run it through a number of different things like focal statistics and different hillshade models in order to give us a really clean, nice hillshade that we call the Swiss hillshade. So it highlights the high ends and brightens up some of the darkest valleys. So it's a little bit better than just the stock hillshade inside of GIS, right? And so that's what we did. We converted, we multiplied that meters DEM by 3.281, turned it into feet, right? Ran the contours with a little simplification and some focal statistics on them, and then also generated the hillshades. So this file structure was all set up so that everything would be really well organized and clean inside the geodatabases and the folders for the Adventure Cycling's database. Now there was other things that needed to go in there, like all the addresses of all the services on the maps, and that included campgrounds and grocery stores and bicycle shops and all these things. So we had to find ways to integrate those in. But for the maps themselves, we also wanted to kick out of the GIS as much labeling as we could, so we didn't have to look back into attribute tables and figure out and hand type labels in. Sometimes this was tricky, right? So when you look inside the lakes layer, there was thousands of small lakes labeled pond, right? And I don't need to go through and delete the word pond on all these little tiny lakes that are like on golf courses or a fountain or all these different things, right? So I just told it if it's labeled pond, get rid of it, don't label it. If it's labeled anything else, then put its label on it, and then I could decide. So it's just little things like that that increase efficiency once I get out into Illustrator. Also, we wanted to label every city, not only with the city name, but its population if it's over a certain population. So we ran this little script that would look at the population, and if it was over a certain amount, then it would label it with whatever was in that attribute value. Makes life a lot easier as a cartographer when you're out in Illustrator to not have to go back. So once you're done and the exports come out of ArcGIS, you don't want to have to go back. There is a way to do it. We can go over it. But you try to avoid it because it's just not efficient. So you run all those models, you get everything the best you can, you turn off all transparencies, you just put outlines on all of your polygons, no fills, you get it all set up, you throw a north arrow on it so it's pointing the right way because our map panels at Adventure Cycling actually followed the route, not north. And that was because we had a rectangle, right? And so we wanted to get as much coverage, mileage out of each map panel that we could. And then you hit export to AI. And it comes out pretty rough. It's like a big giant bowl of spaghetti, right? All the data dumped. Even though we went through and used label expressions to get rid of as many labels as we could, you still have probably more than you can put on your final map. But this is where being a cartographer comes in, taking the time to generalize and stylize your map, right? So you open it up in Adobe Illustrator. Now this is a screenshot of Adobe Illustrator before they had the dark mode. Now it's dark and it's not so bright on your face, but that's okay. It's basically the same palettes and the same tools. Let me just go through a few of them, right? So this one here is a character styles palette. So every single piece of type on the entire map had a style preset so that all the maps in the series look the same. So if you're labeling an interstate, it gets that style. If you're labeling a mountain, it gets that style. You're labeling anything on the map, a contour value, it has a style set for it, right? Those styles are named the same exact things as the layers are inside of Illustrator. And this is very important here. In a second, I'll show you why. So we also had graphic styles. Graphic styles are going to be the symbols that anything that's a vector get, right? So if you have a road that's an interstate, it's going to get this style of stroke, fill, and color, right? If you have a dotted dash line, it's going to represent a dirt road. Those are also named exactly what they would be named back in the GIS database. We also had a palette all the way over on the other side of all the symbols. Wherever there was going to be a bike shop, that's the symbol it gets. A grocery store, that's the symbol it gets. A convenience store, that's the symbol it gets. All the highway shields, on route, off route, and then A through Z of the turn directions that end up on the map. All that was pre-created in a template that is just waiting to absorb any data that you put into it, right? And then pre-made elements. So scale bars, because all the maps are at the same scale, north arrows that need to be twisted a little bit, call outs for specific cities, all pre-made so they can just be dropped on the map and easily changed. So you get your raw data out of GIS, you open up your template, you paste a copy of it in, you take your raw rasters, those go into Photoshop, you clean it up and make a nice shaded relief. Those get put into the bottom of the layer stack as the shaded relief and then just locked, right? And then you run scripts. So we had a custom script made that would take, and once you opened up all the vector layers, locked the raster layers, you would run the assign style script, and that thing would look at every single name in your layer palette, which is down here on the bottom, and say, if it says interstate on route, then assign this graphic style. So it would run through all of the vectors that came out of GIS and automatically assign their styles in Illustrator. And then once that was run, you had a much easier time of working through your map. So now everything has the adventure cycling style assigned to it, and all we need to do is go through and clean it up. So there are still too many labels, too many streams labeled, right? But you start to work through from bottom to top, cleaning it all up. So what I would generally do at this stage is turn everything off, turn on my raster layer on the bottom, and then start at the thing that would be at the very bottom of the entire map, which would be the vector streams, right? And that lays over the raster, and go through and clean those up and see if there's any misalignments or there's problems, and then turn on the next thing. Contours, okay, let's clean all those up and make sure they're right. Oh, we have a glacier, we're gonna have to trim the contours and put blue on the contours that are over the snow and ice, right? And you just work your way all the way up, then you have all of your vector line work taken care of, and then you start turning on your labels. And you start with the most important labels, right, that you know have to be on the map. Make sure that those get placed right where they need to be, and then turn on the secondary labels. And some of them, you find out, I can't label every sub-peak on Mount Rainier. I'm just gonna have to remove and generalize some of those. And once you got to this stage, you could work through this in about 2 to 3 hours. So you would run the GIS model. That would take maybe 40 minutes. Kick all that stuff out, clean them up a little bit more, do the export, get the things cleaned up inside of Illustrator. That's probably another hour, right? And then once you have all your styles assigned, then you're going to sit down and just knuckle into it, put the headphones in, and spend 2, 3, maybe 4 hours if it's a really complex map sheet, getting it all styled and adding all the pre-made elements until you have a finalized map sheet. All right? Pretty cool. Because you're doing this again and again and again and again and again, you get pretty fast. Now, building those big models and stuff, it's probably not worth it if you're just doing a one-off, right? I wouldn't build one for that first forest survey map. I just did it in GIS and got it done. I did some GIS processing for the nicer topo map for the other forest survey, but again, I didn't build a big model because it's a one-off, right? But if you know you're going to be working entire route systems that cover 48,000 miles, then you obviously need to set up some kind of system that allows some automation. And you can get it even a lot more efficient if you start adding coding and things like that. So you start doing Python scripts, and you can even turn this system into a more efficient way of producing maps. So you have a finished map panel, but that's not the end, because Adventure Cycling prints their maps for an entire section of the route on a large poster that has anywhere from 12 to 16 of these individual map panels. These are for 1 day's worth of riding or so. You fold down and that's the one that shows up on your handlebar. But a larger section is printed on a poster. And for that, we brought it into InDesign. Right? So we had an InDesign template, we had the map side, and then we had the services side. The map side covered each one of the map panels, right? And next to it were the turn directions for the entire route, both coming and going. So you had 2 sets of directions. And we came up with ways of doing text styling inside of InDesign. So we had little small text files, just plain old .txt files, that had elements in them that would tell the scripts in InDesign how to style these directions. And then we would place the little turn signals so that they matched exactly what showed up on the map, the A through Z little turn bubbles. A lot of work, but once it was all taken care of, it worked out really well. Right? So here's the services side. All the services for every one of the map panels are listed out with phone numbers, addresses, anything that a cyclist would need. There was also some information on the route in general, some history, some background, weather information, and then a front cover and a back cover with a locator map, and then a master legend. So we didn't have to have an entire legend on every single map panel taking up space. All this was laid out inside of InDesign with tons of different little scripts that allowed us just to import raw text so it would be pre-styled as soon as it came in. And that's what I'm showing here. So there are paragraph styles and character styles inside of InDesign, and something called nested styles, which allow you to just grab raw text files and put them into a text box and then run the script, and it will look and say, anytime there's a return, then add a space and an ampersand. Or anytime that there's a period, add 2 spaces, giving us enough room to put the little symbol for the turns, right? This was immensely helpful. Once we got this system figured out, it was much quicker to move through and style out these maps, both the poster side and the services side. The services side was interesting too, because they were working all of that text data into a database so that people that were using digital versions of the maps would also have that information on a touchscreen. So if they had like a tablet or an iPhone or something, they could just touch on a service that showed up on the map and see a pop-up of the actual text. That was still in progress when I left, and now they've fully implemented it. Right? So it's amazing how the technology keeps going and forces us to come up with new ways to do our cartography. So all of this leads to a final map panels, right? But the whole goal is to get people outside riding their bikes along this beautiful route that follows the crest of the Sierras and the Cascades. So you have many cyclists now that have ridden this thing and done connecting loops and had these great experiences and able to get outside based on the quality of the cartography that we were producing. So that's the presentation I have for you today. Just wanted to give you a quick kind of overview of production workflow. Again, I'll link a document that tells my tips for getting out of GIS and into Illustrator and Photoshop. And I hope that you found this useful. Please like the video or subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.